It's actually brain dead.
Yeah.
That when you download a script, it downloads as an HTML file. And then the best part is that on Linux, file extensions don't mean file extensions. File extensions mean a helpful little hint about what might be inside it. So you can sit there and be elitist and go, not knowing how to use GitHub is user error. Or you can recognize that and we're
When it comes to learning Linux, because here's the thing, right? People will say, "Oh, I don't want to learn how to do this. I don't want to have to relearn my operating system." Besides the fact that not wanting to learn in and of itself is kind of a problem, we're going to ignore that for a minute. You already had to learn Windows, and you're going to continue to learn Windows. You're going to continue to learn the Mac OS, because the thing is, over time, these operating systems change. Okay, these are proprietary operating systems. You as the user do not make a decision in how Windows looks, okay, beyond some basic customizations. Okay, maybe you can change the color of your taskbar or whatever, but you don't really decide where things are. You don't really decide where they're located. For the most part, there's not really a command line interface in Windows. I mean, this is actually one of the beautiful things about Linux. Some people, they don't like the command line, they don't like to deal with it, but the fact is, the same commands that you would have used to set things up on a Linux distro 10 years ago, they're the same commands now. Okay, there's old scripts that are a decade old for setting up Linux or doing specific things on Linux that still work, because they still have the same commands. Okay, they still do the same thing. Maybe there's a couple updates to it here and there, but overall, they're pretty much the same thing.
How can you avoid making your life miserable when switching to Linux? Because there's a tradition among Linux users is when someone says they want to switch to Linux, you actually give them the absolute worst advice, the worst possible. You tell them to do the stupidest things. The most difficult things to do on Linux, you tell a noob that they should do. And it's not just to install Gentoo, it's actually even worse than that. Installing Gentoo is easier than all this stuff. What do I mean by this? Okay, when people want to switch to Linux, and you know, this is an understandable thing, they want to use software that they're familiar with. I want to use Adobe Photoshop, I want to use Adobe After Effects, I want to use Adobe whatever, software they're familiar with, okay? Now, I will go ahead and tell you the punchline to this video. The right thing for someone, a Linux user, to say is, try using Linux native applications. In the long term, it will be better for you. Here's some things you can look at. In fact, you might want to change your workflow. In fact, expect to change your workflow when you switch to Linux, okay? That should be the thing that people say. But what people end up saying in all these forums is that they tell these people to do the most difficult and impossible things on Linux. They tell them, oh, if you want to run all these Windows programs that you know and love, just use Wine, okay? Wine is this Windows emulator, which is a pain to install, a pain to configure, like there are just a million bugs with every kind of program that runs. It's a pain. And we tell newbie Linux users to use it, which is stupid. We'll install Linux on just some random computer, not your main computer, or, you know, if you have two computers, you just keep Windows on one, use Linux on the other. Don't do any virtual machine nonsense, just install it on the actual bare metal, and expect to get absolutely nothing out of it. Expect to just play around. And when you use it, use only native Linux applications that run in your, distribution's native package manager applications. And experiment not just with Linux, but with the Unix philosophy. There's a different way. I mean, if you're using Linux correctly, okay, and this is hard for people to understand if they're new users, because on Mac OS and Windows, they work sort of in the same way. You're expected to do everything within these giant programs, okay? Whereas in Linux is tied into the more classic Unix philosophy, where instead of having one giant program that does a million things, you might have a couple small programs that interact between each other very well and can actually get things done way more efficiently. But sometimes it takes a little time for you to figure out how that works, or to really understand, the idea behind it. The problem when people switch over to Linux is they're just trying to replicate their Windows workflow, okay? Which in most cases you can actually do if you put in the work, but I'm not going to guarantee that that is worth your time at all. In fact, it's especially bad if people are using Linux allegedly, I care about free software, I care about my privacy and security, so I'm going to use Linux. And now I'm just going to install all of this like spyware that I was using on Windows. I'm just going to use Steam now again. I'm just going to use all this Adobe junk again. It's operating system that runs Windows programs best is Windows. It's always going to be Windows. And if you are tied into that workflow and you are not willing to not willing to experiment in different waters, you are going to be miserable if you switch to Linux no matter what. That is inevitable. That is just going to happen. You're not going to have... Now, of course, this is not me saying Linux is hard to use. This is not me saying Linux... Linux, the possibilities with Linux are so much more, inexplicably large than on Windows and Mac OS. It's hard to explain this to people who have never used it, or have used it, but they only use, default Ubuntu or something like that. You can do so much more. And you have so many more potentialities, but getting into Linux has to be a learning process for people. It has to be something they have to see it for themselves, sort of. They have to, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of any kind of distribution or any kind of new way of installing packages. I've talked about Snap and Flatpak. I'm not a big fan of any of these kind of systems that try and make Linux more Windows-like, more familiar-like. Even if it makes it more usable in some degree, usually that ends up you paving over the actual good things about Linux. And so people are in this kind of sandbox where they don't really know what they can do with their system. And using that's the point of using Linux.